As we transition through friends and platonic relationships to romantic relationships and dating and sex, as Covey talks about as being one of the most important decisions that you'll make. This introduction to high school relationships and sex is geared towards just having a better understanding of what kind of issues are out there and the challenges that we have both as educators, parents, and students to truly understand this complex situation. When you look at how we model our relationships, all right, and look at some critical thinking here. As I walk you through each of these bullet points, I'd like you to think about, why are these things happening in our society? The first one in 3 adolescents in the United States is a victim of physical, sexual, emotional, or verbal abuse from a dating partner, a figure that far exceeds rates of other types of youth violence. So in relationships, dating partner relationships, there's a higher incidence of abuse than I think that we realize or that we even talk about. Second bullet point, 1 in 10 high school students has been purposefully hit, slapped, or physically hurt by a boyfriend or girlfriend. So somewhere along the line, 10% of relationships have some type of physical abuse attached to them. And so somewhere along the line, again, people have thought that that's acceptable behavior. 1/4 of high school girls have been victimized or victims of physical or sexual abuse. That's 25%. Approximately 70% of college students say they've been sexually coerced, and coerced means to be persuaded or to persuade somebody that's unwilling to do something by using force, threats, or manipulation. The last one, divorce is pretty common in our society, and I'm divorced and I've experienced this, and I'm not trying to make a judgment about it. I just want to look at some facts. And if 41% of our first marriages end in divorce, 60% of second marriages end in divorce, 73% of third marriages end in divorce, I think that we can see that there's some work to do in relationships, especially if we're modeling our romantic relationships after the relationships that we see by adults in our lives. So my question to you is, in a culture of respectful, healthy relationship modeling, would these dysfunctional things occur at the rate in which we see them? And I would say, I think an argument could be made that no, they wouldn't if we were modeling and having healthy relationships in the rest of society. Teenagers would be more than able to model those healthy behaviors and improve their relationships. Just start to talk about dating and sex as it particularly pertains to high school kids. I think that there's a perception out there that is driving and dictating our thoughts and our behaviors, and that perception isn't reality. And so I'd like to present some information to you in a way, again, just to open your eyes to say, hey, are you thinking about things this way or this way? And do you have an open mind to being at least exposed to some different ways of thinking that might seem to go against what your culture says? I came across a Harvard Graduate School of Education study, and they labeled it The Talk, and it primarily looked at high school relationships and young adult relationships, and how as we as teachers and educators might be able to improve that. And I found some really, what I thought was interesting information. I'd like to share that with you. In that report, the highlight here is what we found and what our report describes, and that's what, again, referring to the Harvard Graduate School of Education study. What they found stands in stark contrast to the common story in our culture about young people's romantic and sexual experiences. And what they're essentially saying is that what we found to be true is very different than what culture says is true. And so we have to navigate some of those things. couple of highlights. ABC did a Good Morning America special on the Harvard report, and I just want to highlight a couple of their findings and what they shared. Number one, we know that over the last 10 years that there's a pattern of behavior amongst high school kids, that the number of kids that are sexually active in high school keeps dropping. Now that seems to be in stark contrast to what we would normally think, the way that our sexualized society, the music, movies, the culture that we live in would say that no, there's a hookup culture and there's friends with benefits, and kids are much more sexually active than they have in the past, and that's just not true. This particular study said that this group of kids, our current 18 to 25-year-olds, are less sexually active than their parents were at those ages. And that's consistent with data that we've seen over a number of years. A large number of teens report that they're unprepared for caring, lasting romantic relationships and are anxious about developing them. And what I took away from this, and it's something that I've learned in my career also, is that we just don't spend enough time with kids about how to deal with relationship issues, how to build relationships, how to, again, what's expected of us in relationships, how do we process the information that we have and apply it to relationships. We talk about sex, we talk about STIs, we talk about birth control, but we very rarely spend a lot of time on relationships. And so this is something that I hope to do with you all. Kind of summarize what the talk said. Teens and adults tend to greatly overestimate the size of the hookup culture. This overestimation can make teens and young adults feel embarrassed or ashamed because they believe that they are not adhering to the norms of their peers. It can also pressure them to engage in sex when they're not ready or interested in it yet. And kind of to play on the same aspect of what we spoke about in the addiction unit, kids that drink in high school hang out with other kids that drink in high school, and so their perception is that because everybody around them seems to be drinking, that everybody is. And we know that that's not the truth either. In the same way, we can look at sexual activity or being sexually active in high school, and the kids that are sexually active in high school most oftentimes are around other kids that are sexually active, and it kind of skews the whole actual view of how many kids are actually sexually active in high school. And like I said, less than half of the kids in this building are sexually active or have been sexually active, in particular because this is a sophomore class. The latest numbers are that less than 35% of sophomores are sexually active. And so again, that when we talk to parents and talk to other people, they overestimate those numbers. They would say that they would be much higher when they're really not. I have a couple studies that kind of show, and I'll just let you kind of read these as you go, but just to outline them, is that what we have found is even with the kids that are sexually active, those experiences haven't met the cultural expectations or the buildup that our culture puts into sex. In fact, many kids, while they are anxious and maybe even excited to be sexually active, they find that once they do make that decision, that the experience isn't anywhere near what they thought it would be. In other words, our culture builds sex up and into an expectation that's often unfulfilled amongst young high school age students. And again, I'm not going to talk about sex being bad, because I don't believe that that's true. Sex within a relationship that's healthy is extremely important, and can be a great experience. It's developing the relationship to a point where sex is a natural extension of that is the key here, and that doesn't happen very often in high school. When you look at this, I like to share this data with you. And again, I try to grab things from different sources so that it's not just one study, or that you think that I might be trying to manipulate the data into having you think one way or the other. But the reality is, in the United States, when kids talk about their first sexual intercourse, you can see here that 69% of girls and 63% of boys uh, go back and say, "God, I wish I would have waited." And what that reflects is that that experience didn't meet their expectations. And so when we start to look at those things, I think it's important to understand that we have some work to do here. All right. I like to talk about this. It doesn't have to be this way. And my goal for all my students is that when you make your decisions meet your expectations. And so this is a decision that you're all going to have to make. And I want you to be able to look back on that decision after you make it, because you're only going to be able to make it once. Because when you do choose to be sexually active, that it meets your expectations, that you have made the decision in an environment and within a relationship that's healthy and beneficial. When you look at uh, kids from Holland, and in that same report that I just referenced about the United States first sexual experience kids being dissatisfied, you can see that there's a different response from the kids in Holland. And so, again, when you look at this, it says I was ready, it was fun, it went as far as I wanted to go. There's much more control here. There's much more feeling of the decision that I made was the right decision for me at that time. And there's a couple of different things that go into that, but I'm going to outline the process that we are going to use to try to make sure that our data, when kids make sexually active decisions, that they're going to be more comfortable with it. I'm going to use the word paradigm, and I want to make sure that you understand what that means. And a paradigm is a model or pattern for something that may be copied, or a theory, a group of ideas about how something should be done. And that second, a theory or group of ideas, the paradigm that we're going to be speaking about refers to that. And it's a group of ideas of how do we help kids prepare themselves to be sexually active in a way that meets their needs and is in the context of a relationship that can handle that decision. We're talking about a new paradigm. Instead of kind of copying what we've always done in the United States and just talked about sex and and either tried to scare kids with STIs and say just protect yourself, or just abstinence only, which also can kind of provide a kids an opportunity for um, kind of staying closed in. There's not a lot of talk going on there. Our job is to try to, again, to be consistent with what we've talked about and take us through the decision making model, which we'll do in this unit also. When we do that, I would like you to consider this, the new paradigm and the ABCD, and this is something that you'll need to know for your final. And the A stands for autonomy, the B stands for build, the C stands for connectedness, the D stands for diversity and disparities. And I'm going to go through each of those so you kind of see the framework of which we're going to operate in this unit. A, develop autonomy of sexual self. And what that simply means is no pressure. The culture in the United States is there's a tremendous amount of pressure on kids. And the Harvard study showed it, that kids will say, well, if I'm supposed to be sexually active, and it seems like the culture is saying I'm sexually active. If I'm not going to be accepted, or people are going to make fun of me. And so I need to do that if I want to be normal, if you will. Autonomy also comes from in the relationship itself, and I'll talk more about this as we go through, but oftentimes there's pressure within the relationship by one partner to want to be sexually active, and the other one might not be ready, and there can be overt or covert pressure, and oftentimes that pressure, we struggle with the ability to say yes or no. All right, so autonomy, as you can see here, means to own and control your sexual decision-making process, when to say yes, how to say yes, and when to say and how to say no, how to anticipate and adequately prepare for sexual activity, and strive for pleasure and enjoyment of sexual contact. In other words, again, no pressure. I think we need to have constructive conversations. And again, this comes from the Harvard piece, and it says most 18 to 25-year-olds have never spoken with their parents about being sure your partner wants to have sex and is comfortable doing so before having sex, assuring your own comfort before engaging in sex, or the importance of not pressuring someone to have sex with you. And again, if kids are wanting these conversations, I think it's important that we try to have them. And so that, again, will be a goal and a focus of my approach in this unit. B stands for build good romantic relationships. Now, we've done a little bit of work on self-worth. We've done a little bit of work on platonic relationships. And the reason that we start in that order is that good romantic relationships are dependent on, number one, you being comfortable with who you are, handling your own insecurities so you don't bring those into a relationship in a negative way. Modeling those types of behaviors in a platonic relationship before it becomes romantic, because we do know that romantic relationships most oftentimes are successful if there's a platonic or a friendship component to it first. And so build good romantic relationships talks about getting to know each other, build trust over time, dealing well with conflict, strive for power equality, and enjoy each other's companies. And one of the things that I like to bring up to kids is I'm going to spend some time on these two words, love and lust. And I think in our society, we spend a lot of time talking about love, but it's actually presented in a way that is much more lustful than actually love. And again, there's some things in the Harvard report that will back that up, and I'll cover that a little bit more as we get into the chapter. Another thing that we don't talk about as much, and I know Covey mentions it in the addiction part, but pornography has played a role in how we view romantic relationships and sexual activity. And in the Good Morning America report, again, in responding to the Harvard the talk, it talks about that middle school males are saturated with pornography, and that has greatly formed this idea, all right, and this false idea that women enjoy domination and degradation, and that there's this idea that if we just model those things that we see in pornography, then we're going to be experience sex in a way that it's intended, and I think that we all deep down know that's not true. But again, because we don't talk about it as much, it's an embarrassing thing to talk about, and but we need to address some of those issues, and so I will be doing that also. C is connectedness and openness to act for advice and having someone to ask, and honest and integrity in relationships with parents and other caregivers, including educators, that allow for open discussion about relationships and sex. It's a big concept for me. And while I believe that the most influential people in your life are your parents, and these conversations be happening with them, we also know that doesn't happen a lot due to a variety of reasons. And so what I need to do, or what I believe my job as an educator to do, is do the best I can to create an environment in which all of you can feel comfortable asking, talking. And while I might not have all the answers, I will give you the most accurate information that I can. And again, my goal is not to make decisions for you, but to teach you how to make decisions and how to base those decisions on your values, how to base those decisions on anticipating positive and negative consequences, how to make those decisions based on your ability to look at different options, and then again, making sure that you are 100% comfortable with the decision that you make, and you are able and willing to deal with any of the consequences that come from that decision. There's two D's in the ABCD paradigm, and it's diversity in sexual development, orientations and values, and disparities in access to healthcare and support resources. And I think the easiest way to talk about this is we have a tendency to believe that everybody sees things the same way what we do. And so we view other people's through our lens, through the lens that we view sexuality, and that's not always the case. And so I would like you just to don't assume that everybody's just like you. Don't assume that your partners and your dating relationships are like you. Don't expect that your classmates all think alike. There's a variety of different approaches and ideas that go along with sexual activity and sexual development and romantic relationships. And so our job is to, again, to recognize and to have an open discussion and dialogue about diversity and disparities. To close this out, what I would like you to consider doing is just to be able to, again, in your own words, explain what this ABCD paradigm is. It will be part of your final test. And again, this whole idea is going to guide our behavior as we move through the chapter and as we do supplemental materials with consent um, and again, trying to build romantic relationships, or at least give you the tools to build romantic relationships, so that when sex is introduced to those romantic relationships, that it's done in a way that's consistent with your value system, consistent with your partner's value system, and that open and honest dialogue is taking place prior to that in a respectful way. And again, while that might not seem um, easy to do right now, as we work through the next week in class, I'm going to try to provide you as many opportunities to explore how that might be applicable in your life.